Welcome to FDA's media availability or briefing following the Endocrine and Metabolic Drugs Advisory Committee on July 1st and 2nd. That's a mouthful. Joining us today are Dr. Mary Parks, who will give a brief overview. Following her brief overview, we will open this up to credentialed media only. Joining us as well for questions and answers from FDA are Dr. John Jenkins, Director of the Office of New Drugs for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Dr. Curtis Rosebrough, Director, Office of Drug Evaluation 2, Dr. Robert Temple, the Director of Office of Medical Policy and the Director of the Office of Drug Evaluation 1, Dr. Gerald Dalpan, the Director of the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology. And joining us today also is our committee chair, Dr. Kenneth Berman, who is with the Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C. I will now turn the call over to Dr. Mary Parks for a brief overview, and then we will open it up to questions from credentialed media. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. This is Mary Parks. I'm Director of Division of Metabolism and Endocrine Products. In recent years, long-term side effects of certain anti-diabetic therapies have raised questions about the adequacy of the current clinical development program for the approval of anti-diabetic therapies in patients with type 2 diabetes. And I would go so far as there were also questions raised about the surrogacy or the surrogate endpoint used for the approval of these drugs. And as follow-up on that, there have been also calls that perhaps we need to conduct cardiovascular outcomes trial because of the side effects or the safety concerns raised were predominantly in increased cardiovascular risk. What was unclear to the agency was what was meant by a call for cardiovascular outcomes trial. Was it to rule out evidence of harm associated with a particular drug, or was it a call that there was a requirement to show benefit on cardiovascular risk reduction? Because up until this point, all anti-diabetic therapies have been approved based on the ability to lower blood sugars, because there's this expectation that lowering blood sugars in a diabetic population is clinically meaningful. As a result, this advisory committee was convened over a period of 2 days, first day being with guest speakers to provide necessary background information, and the second day for deliberations and discussion points, and ultimately to answer several very important questions. Just an overall overview of what has come out of this meeting. On the first day, it became apparent that hemoglobin A1C, the surrogate for which these drugs are approved, and glycemic control, is a well-established surrogate based on very strong scientific evidence of microvascular benefit. However, because of the safety concerns, particularly in cardiovascular risk, and that these therapies are chronic use therapies, it became apparent that additional information may be necessary to better inform physicians and patients about the risk and benefits of these therapies. Also, what came out of this advisory committee were the early findings, really late-breaking news for several critical anti-diabetic therapy or diabetes trials recently presented at the American Diabetes Association scientific meeting just last month. And these trials provided us with some very insightful information on the conduct of these trials in patients with type 2 diabetes, but also gave us information, underscore, if anything, the complexity of the disease process and the complexity of the study design. With that information, ultimately, the advisory committee members today were asked a set of 4 questions. The first one was to discuss how the agency could modify, improve on its current standard of approval for anti-diabetic therapies. The second question was to go into discussion on the design and conduct of a long-term cardiovascular trial with an anti-diabetic therapy. And then the third question was really the pivotal question today. There was some modification to what was originally posed, and that was for those drugs or biologics without such a signal, should there be a requirement to conduct a long-term cardiovascular trial or some equivalent measure or method of such, if that should be required, and if it is required, whether it's required pre-approval or post-approval. And then finally, the last question was if there was a recommendation for such a investigation trial, how this could be applied to drugs currently on the market, as there are no drugs currently on the market that have been established to have macrovascular benefits, nor has there been really good evidence that there's been rule out of harm, cardiovascular harm. With that, I'd like to now open this up to the panel's members.
Does everyone else have any comments before we open it up to questions? Okay, we can take questions from Associated Press.
Can you just describe, it wasn't really clear, just listening, how the size and duration of the studies that the panelists were describing, how that compares to your current regulations for diabetes drugs?
As you heard perhaps earlier or yesterday, currently the agency does ask that companies provide in their phase 2 and 3 program at least 2,500 patients exposed to drug. We also ask that anywhere from about 1,500 patients exposed for at least a year. Now, what was discussed today is an issue of whether or not that is adequate to rule out evidence of cardiovascular risk, and whether or not there is anything that can be done to ensure that cardiovascular risk could be ruled out. Some of the recommendations included what they called a screening trial, and there was some discussion with respect to what degree of risk could be ruled out acceptable. There was also discussion about, instead of doing a screening trial, that is one prospective study, is whether or not there could be a combination, I'll use the word pooling, but pooling does have a particular meaning from a statistical or a methodological process, but a combination of all the trials in the current clinical development program to look at degree of glycemic control. Obviously, in either case, whether it be one single prospective study or looking at the current clinical trial database and how to bolster that, would result in a higher number of patients exposed pre-marketing than is currently being asked.
There was a lot of discussion of all this, of course. The most important question we asked was whether this is a category of drug that ought to have cardiovascular outcome data at some point. And the committee said that they thought it should. There are not a lot of drugs where you need a large-scale cardiovascular outcome data at the time of approval. You can see that people developing non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are getting that kind of data for obvious reasons, because there's been nervousness about that. So they decided on that. There was also a lot of discussion of whether you could gain partial reassurance earlier by doing a better job even before this large cardiovascular outcome study, and that's what Mary was referring to. There was a lot of discussion about that and how much to do and whether you could modify what you're doing now or had to do a new kind of study. So there was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of discussion of that. But to my eye, the most important thing was they were saying, yeah, you need cardiovascular outcome data, maybe just after approval for anti-diabetic drugs, because they're intended for long-term use in a vulnerable population. But to me, that's the big news.
And that was Dr. Temple with FDA. Do we have any other comments?